Awesome, you guys. So thanks. I'm sorry we're going so fast here to try to get all this stuff in today. Jody, so you probably don't know this, but this is actually a BLM facility, which seems a little bit strange for most of us, right? We're used to thinking of Coast Guard facilities, state parks, something like that. So I'm going to turn it over to Jody. She's going to tell us about this place and the cool history and all that good stuff. But I think it's a great example of a couple things, but one, of some of the efforts to preserve some of the ecological resources here, some of the restorations on the bluff. We'll mention some of the restoration stuff. But then obviously here in this case, we've mostly been focusing on natural resources, ecological resources in our class. But obviously cultural resources are a really important part of what's gone on in the coast, what goes on in the coast, what will go on in the coast, right? So this is part of our story here on this part of California and in a lot of our coasts. How did we safely get around the coast? How do we build infrastructure to support commerce and support movement and all of those kinds of things? And so this light station was a key part of that.
So yeah, my name is Jody Nelson. I am an outdoor recreation planner for the BLM. I have a very unusual role as an outdoor rec planner out here though. Typically with the BLM, if you're an outdoor rec planner, that would be equivalent to being an environmental planner in other locations or for other agencies. I don't have to do quite as much paperwork, but I do have to do a lot more volunteer management, intern management, and then also a lot of interagency interface. So with the BLM, we only formally own the little 20 acres as you guys walked through or drove through that big white archway. So we're specific to this point. However, we co-manage an additional 450 acres with state parks, and that stretches from the funky motel you guys were at down to what's locally known as like the Windsurf Beach, which is actually Arroyo Tortuga, just north of Her State Beach. So it's a considerable amount of property, and that in turn, we're also, the National Marine Sanctuary is immediately adjacent. We are surrounded by a marine protected area, so we interface with Cal Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Coast Guard, NOAA, state parks, various law enforcement agencies because of Tonga boats, because people still care about that. And then in turn, we also have all these nonprofits that we interact with, and then everyone's been here forever, so there are these long-standing feuds between various individuals within all those agencies and nonprofits.
Public agency feuds? What are you talking about?
I actually luckily here see less of that than I have in other areas where I've worked, and I've been with BLM since 2011. I started as an intern, finished school, and then was grandfathered into the position out here. But I worked for state parks for about 12 years, both up in Santa Cruz Mountains and here locally in San Simeon. So I've done everything from visitor services, the person that checks you into the campground, to on-the-ground restoration management, and then here, this kind of a combination of both. So as Sean said, this is a historic site. We're on the National, I'm spacing out on the name
Historic
of it.
Registry.
Thank you. So the lighthouse was built in 1875, so it's approximately 143 years. The Coast Guard buildings here weren't built until 1960. And most of the other buildings, with the exception of one or two that I'll point out as we're cruising around, are replica buildings. So they may serve a different purpose than they did formerly, but they are built to spec from the original plans that we had out here. And one of the kind of interesting things that I am now starting to deal with this year, when Sean was describing kind of we're preserving our cultural artifacts as well as our natural resources, is because we deal really closely with a nonprofit, and right now they are all very passionate about restoring the lighthouse and ignoring the natural resources out here. And we now have an administration that is more interested in using the land than protecting it. I am the lone voice of trying to make sure that those natural resources continue to be protected. So somebody asked me, you were asking me about public access out here. Currently our public access is really limited. I would prefer to keep it that way. And that is to make sure that the wildlife and the plants out here have a fair shot of existing. There's been a lot of pressure to open up the gate at the highway, which you guys are here on a pretty mellow day. The elephant seal sees like 1.5 million visitors every single year. We cannot possibly sustain that and think that anything here is going to still have the integrity that it currently has, right? So I've spent close to 10 years on restoration management out here dealing with the plant life. I don't want to see that just be not only a wasted effort on my own part and my peers' parts, but also the wildlife that lives out here, the endangered plants that exist out here. So it's a very fine line, and there's a delicate balance with that. And what we've seen in other areas, Point Lobos is a really good example of this. The original management plan limited their visitation, which of course it was written like in the 70s, I think, to like 35,000 people per year. They see 2.5 million people per year. And so their manager, who is now retiring in part out of frustration, it was trying to dial back that visitation to try to protect those resources. It is a major site for the harbor seal pupping period of time. So they've got some really fragile populations that they're dealing with. And when you put 2.5 million people in an area, none of that really lasts. And it's not intentional. And that's always kind of the thing about dealing with environmental management at all, is you're mostly managing people. And for the most part, I would say 99.9% of the human beings you interact with have no desire to do any harm to anything. But they do it out of ignorance. They do it out of carelessness. All the same things we're all guilty of at different points, so it's not a big guilt trip, it's just something that happens. The more people you put on the land, the more those things escalate, and exponentially it becomes a huge issue. And then there's always that one person who just is kind of a jerk, and they're going to vandalize something. We've already had some issues with Hearst Castle with that. They opened up their tours so that you're not escorted all the time, and of course somebody vandalized the Hearst Castle.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So, you know, but they see a gazillion people a year. It's just one person that did that. It's kind of a constant give and take. The other thing about working with a federal agency that's a little bit different is because we do have a 4 to 8 year flux between administrations, and that puts a lot of different kinds of pressures on people that manage public lands. Sometimes it's great, you get all kinds of funding and lots of support, and they want to do all the things that you want to do, and other times they don't. So if you're looking at management jobs and you want kind of a consistent budget and consistent support, and you're interested in conservation, preservation, biology, you want to go look for a state that has a consistent support for those kinds of things. So California is a really good example of that. There are other states that aren't. So those are kinds of some things to think about. And some states are supportive, but they simply don't have the money. So Oregon's a good example of that. Amazing natural resources, but they just don't have the money that other states have.
And so I would just also chime in. So we're talking about some examples that we're seeing from things or patterns. So the last stop we talked about, or one of our earlier stops, we talked about this notion of the reality of planning and some of the downsides of having all these constraints on everything. Another key one that I think you guys are starting to see here is that a diversity of opportunity, a diversity of things to do. In the case of recreation, right? You guys, so the elephant seals was the elephant seal Vista Point, that was free, right? Anybody can come. There can be a gazillion million people there on the weekends or weekday or whatever. So that's cool. There's Hearst Castle, which is just 4 miles away. That's super cool as well. Anybody, it's free to go to the visitor center and check them out. But if you want to go on the tour, you go on a tram, and it's a fee type of thing. We have expensive hotels. Some areas near here. We talked about the development of San Simeon, and they want to put in some more high-end things, and that's a cool thing. Also, because nearby there's campgrounds, right? There's places to camp for free or for cheap. So having a diversity of things is actually usually way better than having these all be expensive, or all be only camping, or all be only one of these particular groups. It tends to encourage more diverse users, different perspectives, people that are bird nerds, people that are more gourmet people that are more bikers, whatever the deal is. And so that's a diversity of access is just as important as having access, right? Because not everybody maybe people are in a wheelchair and they can't get out to some of these places, so they need a paved path. But maybe a paved path isn't the best way to interpret a wetland for university students, kind of thing. So having that mix is a really key thing, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. So in our site it's not specifically ADA. There are definitely some steeper rises and things that you guys might notice as you're cruising around. But we have a decomposed granite trail that we're going to head out to in just a moment. We have wheelchairs to loan out to people for free. We have strollers to loan out to people for free. And as long as we have enough of a heads up, we can modify tours and otherwise make things as accessible as possible. The only thing we can't do is get people up the stairs into the lighthouse. So we created a really beautiful photo album and we usually have a volunteer that will sit with them and kind of interpret things for them, tell them what they've seen. And yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I am actually very pro planning, and just an FYI, another new and fun things that BLM is doing is getting away from planning and getting away from environmental documentation. They just want people on the land, and so that's another kind of. We were added to the California Coastal National Monument last year. It was one of Obama's last things.
Can you explain? They don't know. They haven't heard that. Can you explain what that is?
So the California Coastal National Monument originated as offshore rocks and islets. So something that is smaller than an island. I don't know what I don't know what measurements they count for that, but smaller than an island, bigger than a pebble. That was originally the California Coastal National Monument. We have always been kind of the gateway to it because we are one of the few interpretive sites on the coast that BLM owns and manages. And but then there was a big push 2 years ago to start adding some mainland pieces to that coastal monument. The idea being, in part, that we would get more funding. Not going to happen. But also that we would be adding additional protection. And for most of the mainland pieces that they added to that national monument, it did definitely add extra protection for those lands. We actually originated as an outstanding natural area. We were recognized by Congress, so that's not something a president can ever overturn. We are locked in being an ONA. So we have pretty much the highest level of protection without being a wilderness area that BLM really engages with. So the national monument status could be taken away by a president. We were not under review at any point, whereas Carrizo National Monument was. I think probably because we're just such a small site. But we are the only piece of the national monument still that has infrastructure, gives tours, does a lot of interpretation. So that is part of our job. The Coastal National Monument is something that a lot of people, probably not you guys, because you are a little bit more in tune with coastal management, but all of our offshore rocks, small islets, they're all breeding grounds for various pelagic birds, including oyster catchers, which are kind of in this weird niche of not being pelagic, but not being a shorebird. They're really locked into rocks that are exposed at low tides. That's where they breed and feed. And they have not been studied enough yet to be on the endangered species list, but a couple of different organizations, and we're part of that, have been doing oyster catcher studies. And because the thought is once we actually get some hard data, mostly because sea level rise, they will be an endangered species for the next couple of years if they're not already. Yeah. So they're also places where a lot of marine mammals pull out to rest and get away from predators. So they're very, very critical habitat, although they're mostly just not something anybody really pays attention to for your day-to-day. The other thing to kind of notice is that when you have offshore rocks and islets, it also usually means that there's a rocky substrate, meaning that you're going to have a kelp forest. So in addition, it's a really healthy ecosystem, with the keystone species being the otter. So when I mentioned that we're part of a marine protected area, it's really controversial. Most fishermen kind of hate them. And our MPA is even more disliked because within a lot of MPAs, they allow limited take based on fishing seasons and all that. This particular MPA is a no-take. So you can sail and surf and do all kinds of recreational things out here, but you can't fish, you can't harvest kelp, you can't take any shellfish or anything from the ocean in our immediate area. It's very small and localized and is specific to the kelp forest that we have in this area. The southern boundary, if you guys see that cypress tree that's kind of off by itself in the foreground on that point, that's the southern boundary. It extends 1.5 miles out and then goes up another 2 miles north. So it's almost immediately just around this point. And then it sits within the Monterey National Marine Sanctuary, which comes with its own limitations. So again, recreation is fine, just no taking of things. And it's been really successful. So they're twice annual counts. If you are lucky and know the right people, sometimes you can get on one of those. They come through twice a year, spring and fall, and they do a bunch of fishing. It's all catch and release. They measure size, diversity, the kinds of species they're seeing, and then they compare that to what they're catching outside of the MPA. The idea of these MPAs is that these fish will have a chance to replenish within an area that would be a fish nursery, eventually spread out to a larger territory where they would be available for fishing. And so thus far, it's been working. They are seeing increased diversity, increased sizes, all of the things that they were looking for as markers that the MPA management was working have all been hit. You guys have any questions about that?
With that MPA comparison, how far offshore are you comparing from like the MPA catches to non-MPA?
Just outside.
Just immediately outside.
Immediately outside?
Yeah. Yeah, and then of course once you get into deeper water.
Right, yeah, I just didn't know if you were going like way far downshore or upshore.
No, they're trying to compare it as closely as possible. And then it's kind of an oddly shaped MPA, so it's kind of, rockfish are really big around here. And so every once in a while we will see fishing goes right outside this rock right here, because it is a little niche just outside of, like literally just outside of the MPA. And it's when you know that the Morro Bay fishermen haven't had any luck all the way up the coast, because nobody wants to burn that much fuel. And that's where they're almost guaranteed to catch rockfish in season. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we head out on the trail, you guys?